Hello, Archie Dunlop here with Talking Astrology with Archie. In this video, I'm going to be looking at the weekend of April the 13th and 14th, 2024. I'm also going to be looking at the horoscope of OJ Simpson, who a couple of days ago died. I think he was 76 years old and he died of prostate cancer. OJ Simpson was huge. In the 90s, he was incredibly successful, football player, actor, everything was going for him. Also, I would seem a fairly intelligent man who had a real entrepreneurial streak. Then it would seem that he killed his ex-wife, Nicole Brown. But of course, he was acquitted, as we know. So from a criminal sense, he didn't kill her. But from a civil perspective, where the burden of proof is less, he was found to be responsible for Nicole Brown's death. And the drama went on, and he later on he was sent to prison for, I can't remember, he was trying to steal back something. I don't know, he spent a lot of time in prison, but anyway, he is now dead. And I'm going to look at his chart. I'm going to look at Nicole Brown's chart. I should really look at Ronald Goldman's chart, because Ronald Goldman was the person that Nicole Brown was with when he killed them both. There was a huge amount of jealousy there. Even though he and Nicole Brown had divorced, he couldn't leave her alone. And at the end of 1993, he'd apparently threatened extreme violence on her. And then in June 1994, he killed her, and he also killed Ronald Goldman. But before I look at O.J. Simpson and the astrology of his life and death, I want to look at the astrology and the I Ching for the weekend. This is a weekend of April the 13th and 14th, 2024. So this is the chart for the weekend. We can see that at midnight, which is a midnight, this is the chart for midnight when Saturday turns into Sunday, set for New York. We can see that at midnight, the moon is in Cancer. So Saturday is a bit of a moon in Gemini day, and Sunday is more of a moon in Cancer day. Now, to be precise, the moon moves into Cancer on Saturday at 6:45 in the evening, London time. That means that if you are in New York, that would be 1845. To take away 5 from that, that would be at about 1:45 in the afternoon. In New York and the east coast of America, the moon moves into Cancer. It would be 11:15 in the morning if you're in California, the west coast. So what does that mean? That means that in the Americas, basically Saturday morning the moon is in Gemini, then afternoon, evening, moon is in Cancer. If you're in Europe, most of Saturday has the moon in Gemini, but then in the evening the moon moves into Cancer. If you are in Australia or New Zealand, then the moon doesn't really move into Cancer until sort of early morning. But still, we can really say, even from an Australian, New Zealand perspective, that Sunday is a moon in Cancer day. So that's the moon. So we do have this changeover from moon being in Gemini to moon being in Cancer. So what does that changeover mean? Well, on Saturday, perhaps there's going to be more of a verbal atmosphere. Perhaps we're going to respond to the world in a verbal way. And with the moon in Gemini, we often have to see that in terms of a defense mechanism. What makes us feel comfortable? When the moon is in Gemini, the most comfortable thing to do may be to talk. Talk can be a great way of protecting ourselves. So if we are running into resistance, we can send out a barrage of words. But on a more positive sense, I think moon in Gemini, we're thinking. We are prepared to consider different possibilities, and we can be flexible. Moon in Cancer is a very different placement. The moon is in its own sign in Cancer, so all things being equal, it's fortunate for the moon to be in this placing. Moon in Cancer can be very security orientated, with the emphasis being on emotions and feelings and security, and memory can be strong with moon in Cancer. Moon in Cancer has great memory. Cancer as a sign is a memory sign, and so things happening from the past may start to rise up. So think about your memories, think about what happened in the distant past, but don't necessarily be overwhelmed by it all. Now, in the run-up to the moon moving into Cancer, just before it moves into Cancer, while it's still in Gemini, it does make a few sextiles. It makes a sextile to Mercury, a sextile to the Sun. So at the beginning of the weekend, for many of us, there is going to be a lot to say. And I think we're going to be able to communicate very well in a sort of nice, easy, uncomplicated way. Then moon goes into Cancer, things do perhaps slow down a little, and as we move into Sunday, when the moon makes a trine to Saturn, starts to make an aspect to Saturn, then there is a certain seriousness, but I mean that seriousness in a fairly fortunate sense, being able to ground not just ourselves, but many of the relationships in which we happen to be involved in. Now, as far as what the main aspect this weekend is, well, there is some competition here between... Well, there is Mercury semisextile Uranus. That is a possibility. There's Mercury at 2021 Aries, and there's Aquarius 21 Taurus. So that is a possibility. You can see they're pretty much exactly 30 degrees apart. If you've got two planets that are semisextile each other, there can be a certain clash between them. It's not like a square or an opposition, but there's Mercury in Aries trying to express itself, trying to think clearly, and then there's Uranus. That creates the possibility of events or surprises which get in the way of free-flowing communication. So particularly on Saturday, we're going to be trying very hard to communicate in a clear way, but events and realizations may get in the way of that. Another aspect going on this weekend, which is probably the major aspect of the weekend, is a semisquare between Mars and Pluto. So you can see there is Mars at 17 Pisces, there is Pluto in Aquarius, 45 degrees apart. Mars semisquare Pluto can be about power. We want to exercise our power, at least many of us do. We want to be in control, and we want to see evidence that we're in control, and we're not prepared to just do what other people say, because we matter. Not just expressing ourselves, but asserting ourselves really is important. Though for some of us, it may work the other way. We may feel that there are people out there who are just being really obnoxious, really desperate to assert themselves, and they may not be caring about what damage they do. So we have to watch out for people who are obsessed with their own power, and maybe we should just stay out of their way. I suppose we could confront them, but that is going to perhaps create rather a complicated weekend. Though in some cases, Mars semisquare Pluto can be about feeling that we can't express our power. It can actually be about powerlessness. We feel that if we were to express our power and try to be in control, that there might be a negative result. And this underlines the fact that Pluto can be a rather contradictory planet. It can push things out into the open. Mars semisquare Pluto might be about being really assertive, being desperate to be in control, but it can also hide things. Mars semisquare Pluto, we may just feel we don't want to express ourselves. We just want to keep our feelings secret almost. So that is a possibility. So there is a certain contradictory way in which this Mars semisquare Pluto could work. That is the picture this weekend. As I said, I think the Mars semisquare Pluto is probably the most important thing going on. Then we do have to consider the heliocentric picture. So this is the positions of the planets from the perspective of the Sun. So this is when we put the Sun in the middle of the solar system, where it should be, of course. The solar system, by definition, everything runs around the Sun. And so this is the heliocentric picture. Remember that there's no moon in this chart, because the moon and the Earth are in the same place. And there's no sun in the chart because the sun is in the middle of the solar system. But there's the Earth. And there are a couple of things that are worth noting here. Mars is square Uranus. Mars 21.8 Aquarius is moving to a square with Uranus 22.47 Taurus. So over the next few days, Mars will be making that square to Uranus. Mars square Uranus can be quite a violent event. People wanting to push their weight around. Technology can create problems. Where you've got a war zone, you certainly have to be worried. There could be events, explosions, disaster, particularly if technology is involved, or the weapons of war. Yes, what really comes to mind is big explosions with Mars square Uranus. But you can get explosions on a interpersonal level, people exploding, people being very tense. Though, as I say with these heliocentric charts, I don't think we really have to take them too personally. There's something very impersonal about a chart that has no ascendant, has no moon. It's more about the collective and what's happening down here on Earth. Another aspect going on today is Venus, not today, this whole weekend. Venus is sextile Uranus. Now you might say, oh, that's good, Venus sextile Uranus. But remember, it's a very impersonal chart. So it is possible with Venus sextile Uranus, there could be excitement in relationships, sudden meetings, or could be sudden fallings out. But you could say, well, it is a sextile, that is a fortunate aspect. But it may be that we should just see it in the context of Mars square Uranus. We got Mars at 21.08 Aquarius, we've got Venus at 22.11 Pisces, we've got Uranus at 22.47 Taurus. They're all around the same degree area, obviously different signs. And so I think it's possible that Venus sextile Uranus may simply be a trigger to Mars square Uranus, and it may just bring in some instability. So I'm not convinced that Venus sextile Uranus is necessarily a fortunate influence. It just could create a bit of instability. But really, I think that Mars square Uranus is the thing that matters, and I think that it's just over the next few days we do have to watch out for it. And that is the heliocentric picture, and I am now going to look at the astrology for the 12 signs for this weekend, which is the weekend of April the 13th and 14th, 2024. Aries, you are in a strong position. I mean, you have to be in a strong position, don't you, Aries? I mean, after all, the sun continues to move through your sign. Your birthday season, well, if you're looking at it from the perspective of the sun sign, if you're a sun in Aries person, it's still your birthday season. But still, even if you've got Aries rising, you would have the sun moving through your first house. It's a time when you are strong and when you need to make the most of everything you've got. And so take advantage of this. Perhaps you're strongest on Saturday, particularly early on Saturday, when the moon is definitely in Gemini, regardless of your time zone. Now, remember, moon's movement into Gemini does depend. It does depend on where you are. So, if you're in the Americas, moon could be out of Gemini into Cancer by late morning on Saturday. So, yeah, dependent on your time zone. But the beginning of a weekend with moon in Gemini, in 2 signs apart from sun in Aries, this is a time when you can express yourself very well. You're very clear about your message. Though I do think as the weekend progresses, things do get a little more complicated, and I think we can't ignore the fact that Mars is your ruler, that Mars is making a semisquare to Pluto. And with Mars making a semisquare to Pluto, I think, Aries, power is going to be very important to you. There is a question, who has got the power? Is it you or is it someone else? And if someone else has got the power, I think, Aries, you're going to be anxious to get it back, assuming you feel you might have lost your power. And so you might feel that now is a time for some dramatic display, to show the world or to show the people that matter that you are in control. And I don't think that is a bad thing, provided you handle it in the right way. I know, Aries, you can be very impulsive and you can just want to do things straight away, perhaps not think about them too much, but you need a little bit of thought. It's not perhaps a time to express your power directly. You, in fact, might be advised to do it kind of behind the scenes, where you don't get a lot of attention, but you are still influencing events. And that's really something you can do. And Aries, you do have power without having to go out of your way to express it. You have clear authority. Once people engage with you at any level, it'll be quite clear that you have authority. And it may well be the case, but that the less you try to express your power and your authority, the more you have it. So you actually can have and cultivate a quiet authority where people respect you without you having to do anything specific to command respect. And you can end up being really the voice of reason. And if there is something that upsets you, you don't have to get angry about it. You just have to explain it. You can actually make it personal. So, for example, if someone says something flippant without really thinking about it, you can give it back to them. You can explain what they said was flippant. Perhaps they'd ignored human feelings, human tragedy, and you can bring some gravitas to the situation, which will immediately make it clear that you know what you're talking about and you're not someone to be taken lightly. So that's your weekend. I think it's a fairly serious weekend, and I think in many ways the weekend gets more serious as it goes on. It's not just because of that semisquare Pluto, it's the fact that the moon moves into Cancer. From an Aries perspective, Cancer is, it's a very down-to-earth and grounding sign. And I think Aries, you can ground other people. And yes, if people are being flippant, you can certainly make it clear to them that they've been stupid. And I think they will actually understand that they're being stupid, and they will give you the respect that you deserve. Taurus. It's a weekend where I don't think there's going to be a huge amount of excitement. I think you might feel that you're not really in the mood for being out there doing lots of different things. You want to just make sure that everything is secure and in order. I suppose from an American perspective, of course, the tax deadline's on Monday, isn't it? And so if you haven't done your taxes, then that's going to be a major concern for you this weekend. Of course, I'm stating the obvious there. It's just that when the moon is in Gemini at the beginning of the weekend, from a Taurian perspective, Gemini is a sign that is very connected with money, and so that might be one manifestation. Even if you're not in America and you're not having to worry about some April the 15th deadline, still, at the beginning of a weekend, I think money is going to be important, and there are things you're going to perhaps want to address financially. After all, the moon, as it moves through the last degrees of Gemini, makes fortunate sextile aspects to the Sun and Mercury, and there can be some sorting out, some organisation, some talking about money. So beginning of the weekend, if you can talk about money, regardless of where you are, I think that might be a very useful thing, because I think people will take you seriously, and you and the people you're talking to, there'll be a general sense that everyone is talking people are talking in a very grounded way, and I think that is going to be helpful. But as the weekend gets underway, you do become a little more outgoing, I think. I think that you can see that maybe there are people to be in touch with, places to visit. But when I say places to visit, I'm really not talking about huge journeys. Short journeys that don't have to last very long. Just introduce yourself and say a few words, and then you can go away again. So don't take that too seriously. There is one thing going on that possibly needs a little bit of caution, and that is the fact that the Venus is conjunct the Sun-Neptune midpoint. Now, with Venus conjunct the Sun-Neptune midpoint, we have to remember that Venus is the ruler of Taurus, and Sun-Neptune as a principle can be about misguided energy. or just not being able to assert oneself in a proper way, perhaps focusing on the wrong things. That could be a danger for you, Taurus, this weekend. Putting energy into something which is fundamentally going nowhere. And at worst, it could exhaust yourself. And that emphasizes the point that you don't want to have too much of an exciting weekend. And if you come across something which you find interesting that you haven't really planned for, maybe there's a sudden opportunity to do something, you're not quite sure what you're getting involved in, it sounds fun, I would be inclined to give it a miss with Venus conjunct the Sun, Neptune midpoint. Yes, it might seem glamorous and exciting, but you have to ask yourself, where is it going? It might not be going anywhere useful. Also this weekend, Mars is making a semisquare to Pluto. And from a Taurean perspective, Mars is ruler of Scorpio, and Scorpio is your opposite sign. So if Mars is making a semisquare to Pluto, you have to watch other people. There may be some people who are trying to throw their power around, trying to be in control. Maybe people you know very well, but they do want things done their way. And you have to ask yourself whether that is really appropriate, whether that's something you want. I think in most cases that is not something you want, and it might be a good idea to hold your ground. I mean, you're in some ways quite easily influenced. You remember what I said? Venus is conjunct with Sun, Neptune midpoint. So Venus conjunct with Sun, Neptune midpoint might be you having moments of weakness, moments when you're vulnerable to outside influence, and then at the same time we've got Mars semisquare Pluto. That could be someone who is trying to influence you. So I'm not saying that you have to avoid other people, but you have to watch other people. And especially if you don't know them well, or if they have a track record of being manipulative, then I think they need to be treated with great caution. Gemini. This weekend starts with the moon being in your sign. At the beginning of a weekend we see moon in Gemini, and the moon makes a sextile to Mercury and a sextile to the Sun. Now, when the moon moves into Cancer, out of Gemini, kind of depends on your time zone. If you're in California, then it'll be out late morning on Saturday. If you're in Australia or New Zealand, it won't be out of Gemini until, I don't know, late morning, something like, 6 o'clock in the morning. Don't quote me on that. It's something like that. So it does depend. So to be safe, Gemini, and if you want to really make the most of the weekend, I would try to have an early start, because I do think that while the moon is moving through late Gemini, it could be very useful, and that might mean if you're in California on Saturday, you should get up early. Moon sextile Mercury, moon sextile the Sun. It's a time when you are talented, you're organized, you're clever, you know what needs to be done, and you can accomplish a great deal. In fact, you can do several things at once. And if there's anyone that you need to get in touch with, then now might be the time to do it. So try to set up the weekend early, because if you leave it too long, you'll find that the moon is out of Gemini, and you simply won't have the opportunities that you had right at the beginning of a weekend. Of course, if you're in Australia, well, you've Australia or New Zealand, you've got all Saturday with the moon in Gemini, so it's not such a a big deal for you. At some stage, though, the moon will move into Cancer, and that does create a change. It creates a greater sense, perhaps, of responsibility. If you happen to be an American Gemini who hasn't done their tax, because remember Monday's the tax deadline, or I think you can get an extension. I think, but don't quote me on that, but I think you can get an extension. And with the moon moving into Cancer, from a Gemini perspective, that is a very financially orientated place. So if you're doing your taxes at the last moment, then moon in Cancer from a Gemini perspective is a very financially orientated place. So if moon is in Cancer, then it's a good time to be considering your finances. So that might actually be an important feature of this weekend, regardless of where you are, regardless of whether or not you've got some April the 15th tax deadline. By focusing on money in a very serious way, I think you can get really good results. And you're helped by the fact that the moon is making a trine to Saturn. And moon trine Saturn is serious. And you shouldn't forget that Saturn is in Pisces. And from a Gemini perspective, the sign Pisces is very, very much connected with career and business. So wherever you are, Gemini, with Moon trine Saturn, I think that you can do some really useful work, not just in terms of money, but in terms of business and career. So, because it depends on your situation, you may be retired, you may not be working. In that case, think about how you are presenting yourself in society. All the people you happen to meet over the course of a weekend. You are out there, you are a member of society, you are clear as a member of society, you might be involved in some organization which may have nothing to do with work or business. Whatever the situation, you can assert your authority. So just because it's a weekend, don't think that there's nothing to do. There is plenty to do. And certainly if you're working over the weekend, or you have the opportunity to do any business over the weekend, Gemini, then I think you can do a good job. And also, Gemini, Mercury is starting to move away from the Sun. And if you've been listening to my videos on previous day, over the last few days, I have mentioned that the Mercury's proximity to the Sun is a bit of a problem because it's preventing you from seeing the overall picture clearly. But now that the Mercury is moving away from the Sun, things are becoming clearer. You're starting to have a greater understanding of what is going on. And I know that Mercury is retrograde, but still things are becoming clearer, and it's much easier to make decisions. Now, I'm not saying you have to make important decisions, but it's easier to start coming round to making decisions. Also on Sunday, Gemini, I would advise you not to make sudden changes of plan. It's tempting to do that, but it might not be such a good idea. This is because Mercury is semisextile Jupiter. Mercury is in Aries, Jupiter is in Taurus. They're in separate signs. They're one sign apart. They're 30 degrees apart. And there may be something coming up and you think you just have to act quickly. It may seem exciting. But I would hold to your course. And at the same time as this Mercury semisextile Jupiter may indicate a few issues with relationships. This is because Mercury is your ruler. It rules Gemini. Jupiter rules Sagittarius. which is your opposite sign. And so if Mercury and Jupiter are 30 degrees apart, then it suggests that you and someone else actually have different priorities. You want to do things in different ways. There's Mercury in Aries. That's you. You want action. You want results. There's Jupiter. That's the other person in Taurus. More slower and more deliberative and, just having a different wavelength. And it's not about a situation where you have to be having an argument or having a clash. It's not like a square or an opposition. It's just a difference in priorities. And with this semi-sextile between Mercury and Jupiter, I think mutual respect is going to be very important. Cancer. So the last few days, the moon has been moving through Gemini. And all things being equal, this might have been about a time when you may not have felt that you were fully yourself. You perhaps wanted to hang back a bit. You weren't feeling incredibly extroverted. You were quite happy perhaps to let other people make fools of themselves. No need for you to make a fool of yourself. You could just watch. But things are changing because this weekend the moon moves into Cancer. When it moves into Cancer depends on your time zone. If you're in California, late morning on Saturday. If you're in Australia or New Zealand, early morning on Sunday. So it kind of depends. But the moon does move into Cancer. And when the moon moves into Cancer, you are in a stronger position. The moon works very well in Cancer. Remember, the moon is your ruler. And with the moon in Cancer, you have a greater sense of who you are and what you want to be doing, and you understand the world better. Cancer is a sensitive sign, and your sensitivity is finely tuned with the moon moving into Cancer. And when the moon moves into Cancer, it does make a couple of aspects of note. The first important aspect it makes is square Venus, moon square Venus. Venus is in Aries. Now, you might hear that and say, oh, square, that could be a problem. Not necessarily, moon square Venus, because Venus, it is in Aries, and okay, I understand that Venus is in its detriment in Aries, but from a Cancerian perspective, Aries is a high-profile sign. And so moon is in your sign, it's square Venus in Aries, and this allows you to really start to express yourself and to show the world who you are. There's no need to make a big performance about it. You can just be yourself, but you certainly don't have to be shy. Okay, there might in some cases be a slight temptation to take things too far, but not much of a temptation. And that is because the moon, as it makes the square to Venus, it's starting also to make a trine to Saturn, and Saturn is about control, making sure that everything is within a certain set of limits. And it does depend what you're planning on doing this weekend, but I think, depending on your time zone, you have an earlier start if you're in California than if you're, say, in Sydney, Australia. But whenever the moon goes into Cancer, you may feel that you have to make your presence felt. That could be in terms of work. If you happen to have a chance to do anything to do with work or business or career, Venus is in Aries, that's good. But it's about prominence in general. Whatever prominence means to you in terms of your lifestyle and where you are in life, it does depend. But showing yourself is important. Letting people know who you are, what you think, what you believe, what you're planning. I think people need to know. And I think in most cases, people are going to listen to you and they will understand what you're talking about. And I think you're going to be making a lot of sense. And with the moon trine Saturn, this indicates that certain relationships can be put on a stable footing. After all, Saturn rules Capricorn, your opposite sign. So if you've got moon trine Saturn, you and someone else are working together very well. And I think that there's actually a lot of scope for mutual understanding. And so that's another reason why you really should not ignore the outside world. And yes, there are certain people who you really do need to be in contact with, certainly by Sunday, because yes, you can have a very constructive relationship with them. Leo, you in some ways have some high hopes. I mean, I'm not saying that your high hopes are on a material level. In fact, they're probably not. You want to believe the best this weekend. And I mean, why not? So it really is okay to be optimistic. But if you are going to be optimistic and believe the best, not just for yourself, but for society at large, you've got to consider a little bit what the reality is. It's nice to be optimistic. It's nice to have faith. And yes, Leos do have faith. And if you handle it right, I think that faith will be rewarded. There are so many people in society who, who'd like to pour cold water on things, who are just overly negative. I'm probably one of those people, aren't I? Always looking at the worst. But there are people like us, and we are a bit of a problem, and I don't think you should let people like us hold you back, because you're a Leo, and I think that your faith can be rewarded. But still, as I said, that is no reason to be unrealistic. You still have to understand that the world the world has its flaws, and you're going to have to work with these flaws and these imperfections. But still, that vision can live on, regardless of how difficult things might be. And you're well placed to put that vision into practice. Well, at least if anyone is well placed. After all, the sun, your ruler, is in Aries. And the sun works really well in Aries. And from a Leo perspective, Aries is a sign that is about vision. And so if you have a vision, then don't hold back. But you don't have to tell everyone about what you think. In many respects this weekend, it is a time for pause and for reflection, and starting to consider what you can and cannot achieve within a particular time scale. So yes, you can have a big vision, but can that vision be put into practice today or tomorrow? Well, maybe not, but that shouldn't worry you. And if you can just pause and observe, then I think that is the right approach. There are things that need to be taken slowly. I think that is really important. And at the same time, don't neglect other people. So on Sunday, the moon is making a trine to Saturn. It's a very low profile trine to Saturn. Though Saturn, remember, Saturn rules Aquarius, which is your opposite sign, has a lot to do with relationships. And so it does seem that you and someone else can find a rapport, but it's an understated rapport. It's not something that has to be talked about. It's about the slow development of a rapport with someone else. And this someone else, it might be someone you've never met before, but it might be someone you've spent all your life with. But there's a new sense of togetherness there coming in with this moon trine Saturn. But because it's moon trine Saturn, it might be centered around a shared goal, something you and someone else both want. You might have completely different approaches, completely different ways of getting there, but the fundamental goal is the same. And that's something you should always recognize. Just because someone is very different from you doesn't mean you don't share the same priorities, the same real big priorities. The trivial things might be different, but the major things certainly are not. Virgo. The moon is changing sign this weekend from Gemini to Cancer. From a Virgo perspective, Gemini is quite a high profile sign, and it's often associated with career, business, getting attention, getting noticed, or on a psychological level, how you and your ego work together. The ego wants things. It wants to make progress in society on a psychological level, and it is how you progress forward with that. And certainly with Moon in Gemini, that is a bit of a priority for you. The thing is that the Moon in Gemini is very much a feature of Saturday. It's not really a feature of Sunday. And if you're in California, for example, the moon will be out of Gemini by the late morning on Saturday. If you're in New York, it will be out of Gemini, early afternoon. So I would suggest, Virgo, that if you've got anything to do that's important, perhaps of a work or career perspective, or you just want to get noticed, try and do it as early as possible. Try and do it before the moon moves into Cancer, because while the moon is in Gemini, you're going to be on best form. Not least because the moon, while it's in Gemini, is making a sextile with the sun and with Mercury. Remember, Mercury is your ruler. So you want to be able to harness that sextile and not sort of sleep through it. Now, if you're in Australia or New Zealand, the moon will be in Gemini, all of Saturday and into a bit of Sunday. So that's not such a problem. But if you're in California, I would suggest you get up early, see what's available, see what you can do, and that is important if you have things to do. Maybe it doesn't matter. And then the moon moves into Cancer. Now, it's not a problem, the moon moving into Cancer, by the way, for Virgos. In fact, moon moving into Cancer for Virgos is pretty reassuring. Cancer is a sign that is about comfort and stability and emotional reassurance. And it creates fewer complications than Gemini. So if you've had enough of responsibility and you just want to be yourself and be with people you know and trust and love, then Moon in Cancer, that is just the ticket. And also with the moon moving into Cancer, you can interact with close friends. So great weekend, particularly Sunday, for meeting close friends and just enjoying their company. But don't allow yourself to be confused or persuaded to sort of go off the tracks, because Mercury is making a semi-sextile to Jupiter. So Jupiter's your ruler. Mercury is your ruler. Mercury rules Virgo, and it's making a semi-sextile to Jupiter. And Jupiter, being ruler of your opposite sign of Pisces, does represent the other person. So if you've got Mercury semi-sextile Jupiter, then you and someone else could have different priorities. I was saying the same thing to Gemini, because Gemini also has Mercury as its ruler. And you just have to accept that not everyone is on your wavelength. It's not about having a clash or a power struggle, anything like that. It's not about that. It's just about accepting that you and someone else want to move in different directions and have different priorities. And sure, you might have very different beliefs. That really is possible. And I think you'd be surprised how strongly some people believe things, whether it's religion or politics. And, if you start scratching the surface and you start finding out what someone really believes in, and you'll start to perhaps realize that their beliefs and your beliefs are just not the same. And you might then get involved in some completely unnecessary argument about something that doesn't really need to be discussed. So probably, Virgo, discussions about politics, but particularly politics, should be avoided this weekend, because at some stage someone might come to a conclusion that they don't want to deal with someone who has different beliefs than themselves. It's possible. So when dealing with people with this Mercury semi-sextile Jupiter, you need a lot of respect. And I also think that you shouldn't ask too many questions, and you shouldn't take things too seriously. So if you hear someone say something that you completely disagree with, that you think is completely abhorrent, don't overreact. All of us have abhorrent views, or at least abhorrent from the perspective of someone else. If you knew everything I believed, you wouldn't be watching this video probably. So we're all like that. We all have these secret beliefs that we don't want to discuss, that we keep to ourselves, all of us. Because if everyone knew what we really, really believe deep down, it would be a recipe for disaster, wouldn't it? So yes, when you're dealing with people on Sunday, just keep it light. Make sure there's keep it light in the sense of not getting involved in anything too complicated. And perhaps you can also consider that, you and someone else, if you have, just find out what a shared priority is. Once you find that shared priority, then everything should be fine. Libra. It's a weekend that may actually be quite useful. It may not start in a particularly useful way. You may not have any real expectations, but sooner or later, I think, Libra, you're going to start to develop a certain sense of purpose. Yeah, that there is actually something that needs to be done, and it's down to you to make it happen. Although I don't think that's going to be apparent to begin with. Beginning of a weekend, you may be fairly laid back. You just want to, take things as they come. It's the weekend, particularly if you're not working over the weekend, if you haven't got responsibilities over the weekend. But at some stage, you're going to be thinking, hold on, you're there for a purpose, something needs to be done. And you're going to be helped by your sensitivity. I mean, you may start the weekend not being particularly sensitive, not really thinking that it's important to be sensitive. Okay, you understand sort of vague things. You might be sort of thinking about sort of spiritual concepts, but in a vague way. That doesn't mean to say necessarily that you're particularly sensitive to what's happening, but as the moon moves into Cancer, you do become more sensitive, and you become more sensitive to what you're supposed to be doing. And there's a little bit of pressure here. You'd perhaps rather not have to worry about obligation. And that's because the moon, when it moves into Cancer, is starting to make a square aspect to Venus. Venus in Aries, that represents you. That's you wanting to do something in your own way, and perhaps you feel that you want to be with certain people. There are certain people you'd like to be with them, and you feel that's what you want to do. And then there's pressure to do something else, to project yourself in another direction, a direction which is more high profile, where you actually have to get something done. And that might be pressure that you resist, but I think it's pressure you shouldn't be resisting. And maybe what has to happen is that you have to take certain people with you. It's not necessarily something that you want to do, but if you feel a sense of obligation, it may actually be a shared obligation. It's not just you that's got to do something, it's someone else that has got to do something. Yeah, the easy option is to do nothing, but that's not, I don't think, the right option. So do consider what this is and where the obligation lies. On Saturday, it's probably not something you necessarily have to worry about, regardless of your time zone. But by Sunday, yes, I think you're feeling that something has to be done. I don't know whether the week begins on Monday or Sunday, but in some respects for you, Libra, I think the week begins on Sunday, not Monday. At least this weekend, the week begins on Sunday, and it's obvious what you actually need to do. I mean, I can't tell you what to do. It all depends on the situation, but clearly there's something you have to engage with. I should also make a point about other people. Yes, other people are important, and you have to consider their opinions. But as I've just said, it may be that somehow you have to take people with you. You have to persuade them that something needs to be done. And there could well be resistance. Because Mars, which rules Aries, your opposite sign, is semisquare Pluto. And you could say that this is a main aspect this weekend. And Mars semisquare Pluto, it is a serious aspect, and it's probably the most important aspect this weekend. And with Mars semisquare Pluto, you may find that some people are incredibly stubborn. They want to do things their way. They certainly don't want to do things your way. And that could be tough. How do you get someone to budge? Well, certain people are not going to budge. And they may even try to get you to completely accept their point of view and to change your plans, because they want to throw their power around. I think in most situations, this should be resisted. That's not what you need. you need to be in control this weekend, particularly on Sunday. But I don't mean control in a manipulative way. It's just explaining to people how you see it and how you'd like things to be done. And so just be wary of other people trying to manipulate you, and you shouldn't fall for these manipulations. But I don't think that would be a good idea. I don't think you can possibly benefit from these manipulations. But don't worry, Libra, I'm confident that you can handle it. Scorpio. I have just been talking to Libra about a semisquare between Mars and Pluto. Indeed, I think that this Mars-Pluto semisquare is the most important aspect of the weekend. Mars is your ruler, and if it's semisquare Pluto, there is scope here for manipulation, and it seems to be you wanting to do the manipulation. This is classic Scorpio stuff, isn't it? Textbook Scorpio likes to be in control. I suppose we shouldn't forget that Charles Manson was a Scorpio. Not that I'm comparing you to Charles Manson, I'm just pointing it out. Being in control is important for a Scorpio, for most Scorpios. Because if you're not in control, everything is under threat. Or at least that's how it feels. And with Mars semisquare Pluto, you are going to want to be in complete control. And I think you can be successful about it. Your Mars is in Pisces. It's actually quite well placed in Pisces. Pisces rules the water signs, at least if you follow the scheme laid out by William Lilly in his Christian Astrology, written in the 17th century. Mars rules the water signs, so it's strong there. You're getting a bit of break. Mars is now separating from Saturn, so a lot of the things holding you back are starting to dissipate. And yes, Mars is now semisquare your Pluto, so you do have an opportunity to exercise enormous control. And if you don't want to do it, you don't have to do it. But a little bit of sensitivity might be in order. You do have to live with other people, and just because you can get your way doesn't mean that you need to have your way. It doesn't mean you have to exercise this power. And I suspect that as the weekend progresses, things will change. I think that on Saturday you are more concerned with being in control than on Sunday. On Sunday, you start becoming more relaxed. You start to get a perspective. On Saturday, you didn't really have a perspective. It was perhaps all about you, your point of view, your emotions. But as you move into Sunday, you're more relaxed. You can start to see the big picture. And when you see the big picture, you realize that it's just not quite so important to be in control all the time. And perhaps you realize actually that you are in control anyway, without having to make a big fuss about it. You do have a sense of real authority this weekend. It's a kind of authority, but it's not really about that Mars semisquare Pluto. Mars semisquare Pluto is more raw. It's not really thinking it through. But there are other things going on which make me think that Scorpios just can have a quiet authority and a quiet vision of authority. And you can say, this is my way of looking at things, take it or leave it, but I think it's the right way. And if you take that approach, you're not too pushy on Sunday. You just explain the way you see it. I think in most cases people are just going to listen to you and they'll accept your view of the world, and you won't have to have a big drama about it. Sagittarius. It's a weekend where it may feel that things are starting to get a little more complicated, especially as you move from the moon moves from Gemini to Cancer. And with the moon in Gemini, for many Sagittarians, it is about other people, and for much of, or at least some of Saturday, it depends on your time zone, the moon is still moving through Gemini, and it's a time where you do have to consider other people and their needs and their demands. It doesn't mean to say you have to give in to people's demands, but you're just aware of what people want, and you perhaps have to compromise a bit. And then the moon moves into Cancer, and this does create a change. At first, it may feel that things are a bit complicated, that are complicated. And yeah, in some ways, yes, things are complicated because you can see what's really going on, and you can see what's going on under the surface. But we shouldn't forget that when the moon moves into Cancer, it is in mutual reception with Jupiter. The moon is in Jupiter's exaltation, because Jupiter's exalted in Cancer. Jupiter is in Taurus, which is the moon's exaltation. So yeah, the moon and Jupiter have a mutual reception with each, are in mutual reception by exaltation. And so as things become more complicated, you become luckier and more aware. And once you make that transition from Gemini to Cancer, you're actually going to realize that you're in a better position than you were earlier in the weekend. You are in real control. And I think part of the reason you're in control is because you understand. And understanding, I think, in many respects, is the key to being in control. And I know that Sagittarius doesn't have a big reputation for being emotional, but by Sunday, I think you're going to be very much in control of your feelings, and you're going to understand what's happening out there. You'll just be able to pick it up, and then that will feed into your Sagittarian intuition. And Sagittarian intuition is all about just knowing, not having to work it out, just knowing. And it's like your intuition and your emotions will be working very well together. But that doesn't mean to say that relationships are going to be completely easy. I mean, it's good that you're so aware of your emotions, and I think by Sunday you will be, but still, on Sunday, Mercury is making a semisextile to Jupiter, and that is important from your perspective, because Jupiter's your ruler, but it is in semisextile to Mercury, 30-degree aspect. 30-degree aspect is potentially quite stressful. It's because Mercury and Jupiter have different priorities. Mercury is in Aries, Jupiter is in Taurus. That's you. It's a more staid sign. I know that Sagittarius is not supposed to be a particularly staid sign in general, but right now your ruler is in Jupiter, is in Taurus, fixed sign. There's Mercury in Aries wanting to do its own thing. And so you may find that another person's impulsiveness could be really quite annoying on Sunday. And it's not that you have to get really mad about it and have a big argument. It's just accepting someone's impulsiveness. And I think that let someone be impulsive up to the point where you're worried that they might be making a mistake. And of course, if you think they're making a mistake, of course, you have an obligation to do something about it. But I don't want to make a big thing about this Mercury semisextile Jupiter. I think the key point is that, yes, the weekend gets more complicated as it progresses, but at the same time, you become more fortunate and more self-aware, and you're really able to understand what's going on around you. Capricorn. Over the weekend, it may be necessary to consider alternative views. It's always important to consider alternative views, but this weekend in particular, and I'm thinking especially of Sunday, and what's happening is that this weekend the moon is changing sign from Gemini into Cancer. And Cancer is your opposite sign. It's very much to do with other people. And I suppose when I say alternative views, I'm not really talking about anything trivial like opinions. It's more about fundamental views on life and the way we should be handling life. And I think that that's something that you should be open to. That doesn't mean to say that you have to make changes for yourself, but you just have to consider what other people are doing and what other people are trying to achieve. And it's important, I think, to be optimistic. I think that optimism is a key part of how you're going to try to negotiate this weekend's challenges. Part of you would like to throw cold water at anyone trying to be optimistic, trying to envision a better future, because you can always think of reasons why. But if you find yourself being negative, Capricorn, I think you need to consider the possibility that perhaps you are projecting. Because what we may be talking about here is your own fundamental optimism. Fundamentally, deep down, you believe the world can be a better place. Of all possible options, the best option can happen. And you're aware of that, but there's also the negativity of your sign. And you're thinking, no, that can't possibly be. And you're saying, you're just putting it to one side. And so when you see someone else being optimistic, trying to envision a better world, then immediately you project, and you might try to put that person down, put them in their place, tell them they're being unrealistic. And what you have to understand is it's all about you. And I think that you have to take this vision that you have of the world, this fortunate vision, a vision where things are better. Yeah, sure, you absolutely know all the problems. You know why this vision might not come true. But you have to go through that. And perhaps you have to have the courage to articulate your vision. Yeah, you know that it's not perfect. You know that there are all sorts of reasons why your vision of the world might never come to pass. But if you keep it to yourself, it's just not going to get anywhere. It's just going to rot. And so, Capricorn, I would urge you to really try to get this vision out into the open and to share it. Because actually that's what people want. If you can start telling people how you want the world to be and how the world can be, then that might actually give people hope. Because people will think, hold on, if Capricorn can actually have a vision, if Capricorn can actually see the world as it might be, then maybe there's hope for all of us. And so, Capricorn, are you up to that challenge? I know that sounds like quite a big challenge. I suppose if you're a sensible Capricorn, you might take the view that I'm just talking nonsense. But I'm being that I'm sort of rambling about nothing, but I do think it is there. I think it is important to realize it and to understand the challenge of the weekend. And it may be also be about the responsibility of this weekend, because you do have to consider other people and what people need. And yes, your outlook and another person's outlook may be different, but you can change things a bit, and you can make people feel much more optimistic and confident. But you should be feeling optimistic and confident. And when you move through Sunday, you find that the moon in Cancer is starting to make a trine to Saturn. And that moon trine Saturn is great. It allows you represented by Saturn, and someone else represented by the moon, maybe not just one person, maybe other people, to find common ground. And common ground may start by you talking about what you want. Again, going back to your vision of the future. You talk about your vision of the future, however that future is envisioned. It might be a future but is focused just on, I don't know, it could be on your family, it could be your community, it could be the whole world, it depends. But once you start sharing this vision, you're going to get some good feedback, and I think that is going to allow you and other people to, I think, get closer. Aquarius. It's a weekend that may perhaps be a little bit slow. I think it slows down as it progresses. I mean, I think that the weekend does start with the moon being in Gemini. And so with the moon being in Gemini, from an Aquarian perspective, moon is very sort of forward thinking, and moon in Gemini can be very creative. And at the beginning of a weekend, the moon makes a sextile to the sun, and it makes a sextile to the Mercury, and it may feel that things are happening. And if you're in California, the moon is going to leave Gemini pretty early, sort of before lunch. So if you're in California, if you're a Californian Aquarian, then get up early, because there are things, make the most of the weekend, because if you, after the late morning, I do think that things will slow down. And that is when the moon moves into Cancer. Of course, if you're an Australian Aquarius, then the moon is going to be in Gemini all of Saturday, and won't go into Cancer until Sunday. But with the moon moving into Cancer, I think, Aquarius, that things are going to slow down, and you might actually feel that things are getting a bit boring. But I wouldn't fall for that. It's easy to think that something is boring, but in fact, it's a time when there's certainly useful work to be done. And yes, the moon might be going into Cancer, but the moon is actually quite strongly placed in, not just because it's in Cancer in its own sign, but also because it is in mutual reception with Jupiter by exaltation. Moon is in Jupiter's exaltation, Jupiter is in the moon's exaltation, and this allows you to do some really good work, to really accomplish a lot very quickly. It won't seem as if you're accomplishing much. You'll be just going about things, but if you're persistent, remember Aquarius is a fixed sign. If you're persistent, you're really going to cover a lot of ground. And the moon, after it moves into Cancer, it starts making a trine aspect to Saturn, and of course Saturn is your ruler. And so moon trine Saturn is about bringing structure to your world and creating a world that can benefit from future opportunities. So you've got a structured world and everything is running smoothly and it's just ready for something to happen. And as soon as something happens over the next few days into next week, you'll be in a position to take advantage of it very quickly. Pisces. The weekend starts with the moon in Gemini. And from a Pisces perspective, the moon in Gemini is, it's quite down to earth. It's often about the home. It's about finding somewhere in which you're feeling comfortable. It doesn't want the stress of having to, mix with other people, that kind of thing. But that's how the weekend starts, with the moon in Gemini. The moon does move into Cancer. When it moves into Cancer, somewhat depends on your time zone. Well, in fact, it completely depends on your time zone. In Cancer, if you're in California, it moves into Cancer late morning. If you're in Australia or New Zealand, it moves into Cancer sort of Sunday morning. So it does depend. But with the moon moving into Cancer, whenever it moves into Cancer, that does create a big and fortunate change. It's a fortunate change, not just because the moon is moving out of Gemini. It's because the moon is moving into a sign, the sign it rules. It's ruling into its own sign. Moon rules Cancer. Further, the moon is in mutual reception by exaltation with Jupiter, and Jupiter is your ruler. So the last half of the weekend really does look very fortunate for you. Things are really going to happen, and I think you're going to be able to express yourself, and you're going to be comfortable in your own creativity. You're going to realize that there are things you can do, and it's certainly important that you don't doubt yourself. With this moon mutual reception to Jupiter by exaltation, if there's something that in the recent past you felt you couldn't do it, there's no point, you don't have the ability, or maybe you're too rusty, no one cares. No, that is completely the wrong attitude. And as you move into Sunday, at the latest, you're going to be able to realize what you can achieve, and I think you're also going to realize that you can actually make things happen in a perhaps a fairly quiet, understated way, but you can still definitely make things happen on Sunday and do something beautiful, and make sure that you've got people around you who respect what you're doing. Now, you don't actually need, by the way, to have people around you to admire what you're doing. That's actually not necessary. It's just an added bonus. But I think you can actually find people who do understand and appreciate what you're trying to achieve. And it's not just trying to achieve, it's actually what you are achieving. And it's therefore, extremely important that you don't doubt yourself. And as Sunday progresses, the moon starts to make a trine aspect to Saturn. Remember, Saturn is in Pisces, it's in your sign, and it seems that a lot of people who are Pisceans are really benefiting from Saturn being in Pisces. Saturn has been in Pisces for over a year, and I know that Saturn has a rather grim reputation, but I think many Pisceans are finding that Saturn has helped give them structure and has given them a greater control over their lives. And with the moon making a trine to Saturn, this control is made even clearer. And when I say control, I don't mean control in a sense of control freak. I mean it in the sense of knowing what's going to happen next and having an idea, being able to put that idea into practice. And this is really how you're going to be able to benefit from Moon trine Saturn. So overall, Pisces, I think it looks like it could be a great weekend. And in fact, of all the 12 signs, I think, Pisces, it may well be the case that, all things being equal, you're in the best position to really make the most of everything that's on offer. Those are the 12 signs. And now I want to look at this weekend from the perspective of the I Ching. So, as usual, I ask the question, what is the weekend going to be like for those watching the I Ching section of this video? Just a reminder, you don't have to watch the I Ching segment of this video if you don't want to. If you don't watch it, then it doesn't apply to you. So let's look at the first hexagram I got. And the first hexagram I got was hexagram 55, which is abundance. Sounds good. Everything's there. And I think that the Wilhelm I Ching says something like, "Be not sad like the sun at midday." Abundance is about the peak of society. It's when the sun is on the upper meridian. It's noon, and things can't get any better. It's great, but we need to enjoy this moment, because maybe this moment it's reached its peak, and it's not getting any better, and we should just be happy. We shouldn't think about what might happen in the future. The inevitable decline, that's going to happen at noon. After noon, the sun starts to set towards the western horizon. So we may be involved in something over the weekend that maybe can't last, but we should enjoy it while it's there. And there is a moving line. And this moving line is interesting. So this third line moves. And the third line is actually about a solar eclipse. Well, we've just had a solar eclipse. And it refers to a time when the sun is suddenly dark. And the Wilhelm translation talks about being able to see the stars at noon, which in theory you can do. You can see the stars at noon. And the only time when you can see the stars at noon is when you've got an eclipse. So what actually does this mean? It means that in spite of our great worth and our authority and our talent and our experience, we may find ourselves being eclipsed. Don't worry, it's not as bad as it sounds. And people can't see us. We're like the sun, we're eclipsed. And that means that other people who don't have our talent and experience are getting the recognition. We're not getting the recognition. Other people are getting the recognition. And that might be irritating. And the I Ching talks about one's right arm being broken. And it sees the right arm being broken not as a big problem. It sees it as just a temporary problem. So I suppose we have to be a bit literal here sometimes. And if the I Ching has talked about right arms being broken, we have to sort of say, watch your right arm. Avoid doing anything that could lead to an accident. Simply because the I Ching has simply referred to a part of a body part, and it's talked about an injury. But from a symbolic point of view, this right arm being broken is seen as a temporary injury, as a temporary setback. It's not something that it's not our fault, it's not our responsibility, we're not to blame for this, and we will get over it. So it is a temporary situation in which we find ourselves eclipsed, where other people are getting the recognition when we know they don't deserve the recognition, do they? But that might be what we start to experience over the weekend. But abundance, it does move to a different hexagram. and it moves to hexagram 51, which is thunderbolts. Well, Greg Winkup translates it as thunderbolts. The Wilhelm translation of the I Ching translates it as the arousing. The arousing as in thunder, suddenly things happening, and there's a sense of shock. And perhaps this shock is almost certainly beneficial if we consider what's been happening in the previous hexagram, because in the previous hexagram we end up being eclipsed. People can't see us, people don't recognize us, but then there is a shock situation, and I am assuming that that means that we get the recognition we deserve through this external event. It happens, and then we can see people's true worth, and it's clear that we're the ones that matter. We're the ones that really need to be taken seriously. And there's another thing about with the shock. It is a shock, but when we're making the sacrificial offering, or when we've got incense in some bowl and we're about to put it on the fire, we don't drop any of the incense. So it's not such a bad shock that we drop the incense. We're able to keep our cool and keep calm. And I think that we in the end benefit from it, because in the end we realize it's not such a big deal. Nothing has changed. Well, in fact, something has changed. And what has changed is that we're getting the recognition we deserve, perhaps because of some external event which forces people to change their focus, and suddenly they realize, yes, we're the ones that matter. We're the ones that should be taken seriously. But I don't mean that in an egotistical sense. It's all about, from a Confucian perspective, society working well, and we all have our role in society, and not just society, in the family, in whatever hierarchy we're involved in. We have our role, and at this particular time we've got something to offer, and perhaps we might have, to begin with, felt that we were being ignored. And this might actually relate back to the eclipse at the beginning of the week. What was going on, say, on Monday, feeling a bit eclipsed, but there's a shock, and we can now move on, and we can get the recognition that we deserve and which society needs. That's the I Ching, and I now want to look at OJ Simpson. And what's good about OJ Simpson's chart is we've got a time of birth. We've got a time of birth for Nicole Brown. So we've got accurate times, which really makes things a lot easier. So let's switch over. Okay, so top right, of course, that is OJ Simpson. And I want to start by looking at OJ Simpson's natal chart and what stands out about it. I do not think that this is a chart where you could say, oh yeah, this person is really violent. I don't think it's, well, perhaps it's probably no chart that is really like that. But after the event, we know he's killed two people, he wasn't convicted in a criminal court of killing two people, but it's generally thought that he did kill two people. He killed his wife, or his ex-wife, and a man who happened to be with her. I don't really know what the relationship between Nicole Brown and Ronald Goldman actually was. But he was just there, and it would seem that OJ Simpson killed both of them in a jealous rage, and he had, of course, already threatened the previous year to do something really bad to Nicole Brown. So what in this chart gives us concern? Well, the first thing I do notice about OJ Simpson is that he doesn't have any earth in his chart. Okay, he's got the part of fortune at 3 degrees Taurus, but he has no earth. He's somewhat ungrounded, Now, just because you've got no Earth doesn't make you violent. It just may say something about his perspective. Maybe it's just he's someone who clearly found it very easy to make money. I think when he was in high school, he was making money. I think selling tickets or something. And then he became a football star, and then he was almost effortlessly able to become a movie star. What was it? Naked Gun. There were other films, and he was also at the time of his killing, he was making something called, I think it was called Frogman. Was it about, I don't know what it was, about Navy SEALs or something. And during Frogman, he got to practice using a knife, and that was perhaps explanation how apparently he was able to use this knife to kill 2 people, if the allegation is correct. But yeah, the lack of Earth. Maybe things were too easy. He just did not have much of a relationship to the real world here, because everything was too easy. So that's one aspect of it. But given the fact that he killed 2 people, almost certainly killed 2 people, Moon is square Uranus, and Moon is in the 8th house. So if you've got Moon in Pisces in the 8th house, there could be an association with death and destruction. Perhaps it's square Uranus. Moon square Uranus can represent someone who has a real temper, and a temper that is quite a mutable temper. This is not Moon in Scorpio. This is Moon in Pisces. And with Moon square Uranus, he could just fly off the handle very quickly. It's not even perhaps if the anger is building up. I don't know. It just suddenly happens. And that's possibly how the Moon square Uranus is working. I should also say something about his elements. He has got a lot of stuff in water. Of the 7 planets, of the 7 traditional planets, he's got 5 of them in water signs. So he's got the Sun in Cancer, he's got the Moon in Pisces, he's got Mercury in Cancer, he's got Venus in Cancer, he's got Jupiter in Scorpio. And so if you have got someone with so many planets in water, this is a person who is extremely emotional. And in his case, it would seem that he didn't really fully know how to deal with his feelings. They could just go all over the place. And he is a Cancerian. And Cancerians have a certain reputation for being possessive. And they don't like it when someone is disloyal, even if they themselves are completely responsible for that disloyalty. So even though Nicole Brown was his ex-wife, he still felt possessive towards her. And here we have this really intense possessiveness. And this is, let's not forget Henry VIII. Henry VIII was a Cancerian, and of course he had 6 wives. He actually only had 2 of them beheaded. What was it with Henry VIII? It was divorced, beheaded, survived, divorced, beheaded, died. So that was only 2 of his 6 wives he beheaded. So chances are, if you were married to Henry VIII, you wouldn't be beheaded. Only 2/3 of them were not beheaded. But still, when one sees OJ Simpson, I don't know, maybe it's just me, but I think of Henry VIII. But there is that possessiveness, and there is that anger, which can be about having can be about having Sun in Cancer. Now, that Sun in Cancer is on the Saturn-Uranus midpoint. So let's have a look at Saturn and Uranus. So there is Saturn and there is Uranus. And you can see that the Saturn and Uranus are in semisquare. So there's a pretty close semisquare between, it's not exact, but there is a semi-square between Saturn and Uranus. So the Saturn and Uranus principle is quite generational. People born around this time, middle of 1947, would have the Saturn-Uranus semi-square. It's about tension. Saturn is about restriction. Uranus is trying to break out and do something original and revolutionary and wanting to break free. So a lot of people would have that Saturn semi-square Uranus. Maybe not a big deal, but the thing is, the Sun is on the Saturn-Uranus midpoint. So because the Sun is on the Saturn-Uranus midpoint, it makes that Saturn-Uranus semi-square personal. And so there is that inner tension there, and there is that capacity to cause a lot of destruction, potentially. Another thing we might want to look at is his Mars. His Mars is actually the planet closest to the midheaven, and that Mars is a little bit too strong. From a traditional perspective, using the concept of sects, sects, the Mars is unusual, but it is a nocturnal planet that is masculine. It's the only nocturnal planet that is masculine. So if you've got a nocturnal planet, it functions best during the hours of night. But this is a daylight chart. And being a daylight chart, I shouldn't have said too strong. That's the wrong word. I don't mean that. Let me take that back. Not too strong, but it's just too prominent given its overall condition. Yes, it's a masculine planet, Mars. It's in a masculine sign. But it's just too prominent given its overall status. It shouldn't be there. It's just wrong at Mars. And I think that gives him a certain amount of aggression. I mean, I don't think you just see that Mars and say, oh, he's a killer. No, definitely not. I don't think you'd even see the whole chart and say that's a killer. Of course, we are working on the basis of hindsight, but that Mars is a bit overwhelming. It's kind of not in its proper place. It should be below the horizon at night. Sorry, in the daytime it should be below the horizon. If it was a nocturnal chart, that Mars would be more constructive. But in a daytime chart, I think that there is a problem there. So that's OJ Simpson's chart. Then there is the chart of Nicole Brown. So Nicole Brown is the woman he killed, his ex-wife. And I don't want to say too much about it. She was born May the 19th, 1959. And what stands out to me is the fact that she has a Sun-Jupiter opposition. And that Sun-Jupiter opposition is exact. And you could say that in a woman's chart, the Sun as a male planet represents the man she marries, or her partner. It's projected onto someone else, and the Sun is reasonably close to Algol. It's not exactly on Algol, but it's a few degrees from Algol. Remember, Algol is that fixed star associated with decapitation, bad things happening. And so it's reasonably close to Algol, and it's exactly opposition Jupiter. And so it may be that she is going to hitch up with someone who is a Sun opposition Jupiter kind of person, someone who is over the top. Look at that Jupiter in Scorpio. that Jupiter in Scorpio is quite intense, isn't it? In Scorpio, and it is opposition her sun, and there's Chiron. So Chiron, she's got an exact T-square involving Chiron. So Sun opposition Jupiter, Chiron. Well, Chiron wound. I don't know about healer. She's certainly wounded here. She was killed, but I think that Sun Jupiter opposition does represent OJ Simpson. On the other hand, she was born at night, and if you have a woman born at night, you could argue that the planet that most describes her future husband, the man in her life, is not the sun, but it's Mars. And there's Mars. Mars is at 22 Cancer, which is, of course, 22 Cancer is the same, is in the sign that OJ Simpson had his sun. So by looking at the sun and Mars, I think you do get an idea of OJ Simpson, the man she eventually married, and of course the man who eventually killed her. So that's her chart. I don't know if I want to say anything else about it. Oh yeah, she's got Venus opposition Saturn. Venus at 9 Cancer opposition Saturn at 6 Capricorn. Just because you've got Venus opposition Saturn doesn't mean to say you can't have a perfectly good relationship. It's not, it's not in itself a curse, but clearly in her case, having Venus opposition Saturn suggests relationship issues, and she has another T-square. There's her moon in Libra. Now, from a whole sign perspective, and Placidus, it's moon in the 7th. From a whole sign perspective, it's moon in the 8th. And so she's got moon opposition her Venus and Saturn. Maybe that moon in Libra, that could have been her undoing, perhaps. And I know it's conjunct the North Node. Perhaps she was being too reasonable. Maybe she was too quick to give in to OJ Simpson's advances or whatever when deciding that he was the man she was going to marry. But that Venus opposition Saturn is, I would have said, really, really difficult. And just going back to OJ Simpson's chart. So remember, she's got Jupiter in Scorpio, and this Sun in Taurus, Jupiter in Scorpio. So going back to OJ Simpson's chart, now he was quite a bit older than her. I mean, he was 12 years older than her, and he has Jupiter in Scorpio. So she was a whole Jupiter cycle younger than him. And OJ Simpson has a very prominent Jupiter in Scorpio. Jupiter's conjunct the IC. I would have said, you could say that Jupiter on the IC, conjunct the IC, might have made him lucky. I mean, it's a good place to have Jupiter on the IC. Should make you feel comfortable. Fixed income, fixed assets. So could have really helped in terms of his prosperity. Of course, he became extremely rich, but through the death of Nicole Brown, of course, it all came to nothing. Now let's look at what was going on at the time that OJ Simpson killed Nicole Brown, which I don't know precisely. It was on June the 12th, 1994. I don't know whether that's a precise time. It may have been 10:15. Look at the position of Jupiter. Jupiter's in Scorpio again. There seems to be this Jupiter in Scorpio theme here. I don't know whether it was on the midheaven. There was a dog was heard barking, I think, at 10:15 that night. So maybe it was quarter of an hour later. Maybe Jupiter wasn't exactly on the midheaven. But Jupiter was certainly in Scorpio. And the question is, what was happening to OJ Simpson at this time. So, well, so let's start with OJ. Let's consider OJ. Okay, that's OJ Simpson's chart in the middle, and that's OJ Simpson's chart, and that's at the time. That's what was happening at the time of the killing. In terms of transits, it wasn't actually that dramatic. I can't see a lot going on here. There is OJ Simpson's Mercury at 24 Cancer. So Uranus and Neptune, remember that there was a Uranus-Neptune conjunction around the time of this killing. So Uranus and Neptune were opposition his Mercury roughly at this time. I mean, not exactly there, but I think this was a time, if you've got Uranus and Neptune opposition your Mercury, you're going to be quite confused and disturbed. So that might be one aspect of it. So I don't think he was obviously not in a very good state of mind at the time. Turning to the solar arc directions. So we might also want to consider the solar arc directions that that he had. In fact, I'm going to look at a solar return instead. So let's look at the solar return for OJ Simpson before the killing. There's that Uranus-Neptune conjunction I was talking about. And so this is set for July the 8th, 1993. So there was a Uranus-Neptune conjunction, and the Sun was opposition the Uranus-Neptune conjunction. So that might indicate a certain amount of violence. I mean, you do look at the solar return when trying to understand what's going to happen over the next year. What that does reflect is that a couple of years earlier, a year or two earlier, Uranus and Neptune had been transiting his Sun by opposition. But still, it's a reminder that this Uranus-Neptune opposition Sun is still very much there. And we can look at the Moon. Look at the Moon. The Moon is at 11 Pisces. So the Moon is opposition his Mars. Moon is opposition Mars at the time of the solar return. So that's another indication of violence. Moon in Pisces. Remember, OJ Simpson has got Moon in Pisces in his natal chart. So in the chart before the killing, he had Moon. Moon was there in Pisces. And so I think that solar return sort of fits. I'm not saying it provides the whole answer, but it does indicate perhaps a difficult year ahead. Then we should consider Nicole Brown and what was actually going on for her at the time of her killing. So she was killed on June the 12th. She was a Taurus, and so this is her solar return set for. There's her sun in Taurus. So that's her solar return for May the 18th, 1994, which would have been 3 weeks before she was killed. And I think there are things we need to look at in this solar return, because I think this is really quite a difficult solar return. So there's her sun at 27 Taurus. Sun is opposition Pluto. So that means that it was a time of life when Pluto was opposition her Sun. So in general, if you're a woman who's got Pluto opposition your Sun, and you've been through a divorce and you've just divorced OJ Simpson, you can understand that Pluto opposition Sun is about a power struggle. There are issues of jealousy. That's one thing that seems to be very clear. But it's the moon that really brings things out. Look at the moon. The moon is square her sun. Moon is square Pluto. So with that moon square sun and this T-square, moon opposition Pluto, and the moon square both of them, it seems that T-square would have been a real warning there. And I think that that solar return 3 weeks before she died is really indicating that there might be a problem. And her sun in Taurus, there it's trine Uranus in Capricorn. Now you might say Sun, Uranus, trine Uranus, oh, that's a good thing, but you have to think about it. Uranus is just about, could be easy violence. That is a way of looking at it. Another thing about that solar return is that she has Saturn at 1122 Pisces. So Saturn is exactly on her descendant, pretty close to the descendant. And that really tells us what we need to know, doesn't it? That problems in relationships, and indeed this represents someone actually killing her. It looks like her ex-husband killing her, Saturn on the descendant. Now that is exact, fairly exact, and that really characterizes the solar return. Now, I would remind you that this solar return is not set for Los Angeles. It's set for Frankfurt am Main. It's set for Frankfurt, not Los Angeles. The reason it's set for Frankfurt is because she was born in Frankfurt. And this underlines my view of solar returns. That when you do solar returns, you should be looking at solar returns from a perspective of someone, when someone was born, not where they actually are at the time of their birthday, especially if you're dealing with stuff that is kind of fated. Now, I know there are examples of solar returns set for someone's place of birthday. I looked at a few weeks ago, I looked at Adolf Eichmann's chart and his solar return for when he was kidnapped in Buenos Aires. And certainly for Buenos Aires, solar return was much more powerful than his solar return for where he was born in Germany. But so it's not an absolute rule, and I suppose you have to experiment with it. I must make this clear. I'm not saying you must always use the place of birth to calculate your solar returns. I'm just saying that given the choice, I prefer to use the place of birth to calculate the solar returns, not where you are. But this solar return is set for Frankfurt in Germany, and Saturn was exactly on her 7th house cusp, which I think fits very well. Turning to Nicole Brown's transits for when she was killed. So there is Nicole Brown, her chart in the middle. There are the transits for June the 12th, 1994. Firstly, Pluto is conjunct her Jupiter. Remember this whole Jupiter in Scorpio thing? It just keeps coming up. Jupiter in Scorpio is Pluto is on her Jupiter in Scorpio. Okay, it's not exactly on her Jupiter in Scorpio, but Pluto's reminder that transiting Pluto conjunct her Jupiter, kind of opposition her Sun. It's not exactly there, but it's kind of giving us an idea about the broad sense of what's going on in her life. And Jupiter in Scorpio is conjunct her Neptune, fairly closely conjunct her Neptune, and Neptune was at 2246 Capricorn. So Neptune was opposition her Mars. Again, not exact, but these outer planet things. This is just giving the general picture of what was broadly happening when she was killed. It's not, as I said, it's the overall situation that she just happened to be in. And remember also that in her solar return she had Saturn on her descendant, and in her natal chart she's Pisces rising. So Pisces had, Saturn at the time she was killed was at 12 Pisces. Her ascendant was 7 Pisces, and so that ties in with the solar return. She's got Saturn sort of close to her ascendant, transiting, and Saturn was on her descendant in her solar return set for Frankfurt. And I think that's pretty much all I want to say. One thing I want to look at OJ Simpson's solar arc directions for when he did the killing. So let me just do this. So here is, okay, let's go back to, so that's OJ Simpson's chart. So we're going to calculate the solar arc directions for when, so we're going to calculate the solar arc directions. Remember, this solar arc directions, we move every single planet 1 degree for every year of life. And so in, I don't know how old he was. He was born in 47, so he would have been sometime in his late 40s. So we basically move everything for the number of 1 degree for every year that OJ Simpson has been alive for. So let's just look at his solar arc directions for this. I think I did calculate this earlier, but I sort of lost it. So that's his solar arc direction set for June the 12th, 1994. And then we are going to compare those with his natal chart, see if there was anything interesting going on. And so that's Uranus was sort of moving towards his Saturn. He had the Sun was sort of moving into Virgo. I don't think that there's a great deal going on there. His solar arc directed ascendant had sort of moved on to his Neptune. So I'm not saying that his solar arc directions were particularly spectacular when he committed the crime. His solar arc directions for when he died, that's another thing to consider. This is for when he died. There's one thing I did notice for when he died. So he died on the 10th. So so this is when you move everything by 76. You move everything by 76 degrees, and there are 2 solar arc directions for his death, which I want to just mention. Firstly is his solar arc directed Sun. His progressed Sun was at 0 degrees 31 degrees Libra. So I believe he said that he had cancer on. He announced that he had cancer of the prostate last year, and so the Sun has just gone into Libra. In other words, the Sun has just gone into the sign of its fall. And so when you're dealing with secondary progressions and you see the Sun moving into its detriment or its fall, that can be a sign that things are going to get worse, that there might be difficulties. So that kind of fits. Another thing is his Chiron. His solar arc directed Chiron was at 1617 Capricorn, and there is his Sun at 1636 Cancer. So solar arc directed Chiron was moving towards an opposition of his Sun, and that seemed to have some impact on his death. The absolute final thing I'm going to look at is his acquittal on October the 3rd, 1995. This is what everyone was looking at. And it was huge news. And so you would have thought his acquittal would have been a major thing. What was going on in OJ's life when he was acquitted? I mean, he should have been found guilty. All, you know, the evidence was against him, but the police messed up. There were allegations, I think, of racism, the jury, and I think the jury went for OJ Simpson. There are also fears, I think, of sort of riots in Los Angeles. I think there had been recent riots, and that what would have happened if he had been found guilty. So that might have had an impact on the jury's verdict. But what was happening for OJ when this happened? Well, remember, Jupiter in Scorpio. OJ had Jupiter in Scorpio. By this time, Jupiter had moved out of Scorpio. But Mars was at 1754 Scorpio. And OJ's Jupiter was at 1745 Scorpio. So OJ had Mars exactly conjunct his Jupiter and moving onto his IC. Now, normally, Mars conjunct your IC can be actually a really quite difficult aspect. And you would have thought Mars conjunct IC, well, you know, when you've got a verdict coming up, I wouldn't have been too optimistic about it. But it's because he had Jupiter on the IC. And that's really what helped him. And that Mars was also trine his Sun. So he has Sun trine Jupiter in his natal chart, and that Mars was triggering it all. So those are a few thoughts on OJ Simpson. I'm afraid that was really chaotic, and I was going all over the place. But there were a lot of charts to consider, and also I did want to look at Nicole Brown's chart. And I hope you found that of some interest, of some use. And if you enjoyed this video, I would be very grateful if you were to like it by pressing the like button. If you're not subscribed and you enjoyed the video, I would of course be super grateful if you were to subscribe. And if you want to buy me a coffee, there is a link in the description. So thanks very much for listening, and I will talk to you again very soon.